Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last series of our Facebook Live composting workshops. Thank you for joining me. My name is Catherine. I'm Facilities and Sustainability Manager here at the Living Coast Discovery Center. We are a nonprofit zoo and aquarium located in Chula Vista, California. Thank you so much for sticking with me if you've been here for the past 5 videos. We just finished celebrating International Compost Awareness Week this past week. I hope you were able to share any of these videos, maybe share your composting stories with friends, family members through social media. And I hope that maybe if you took on composting during our stay-at-home orders, that your composting is doing well. Feel free to share your stories with us. I'm happy to hear, I like to hear other people's stories and where they are in their composting world. Today's focus will be on answering your questions. So now's the time, if you have any questions whatsoever on your compost bins at home, just composting in general, please feel free to ask them in the comment section below. Educator Ashley is behind the camera today. We are practicing our social distancing and our facial coverings, but she'll be able to ask me any questions in real time. While we wait for some of those questions to come in, we're going to take a look at the soil saver bin that I put together on the first week of our workshop. So I turned most of it just in preparation for the video, so it's not so long. But if you can come on in, Ashley, let's take a look at what this material kind of looks like after our 6 weeks. So here we have some of the greens still breaking down and the browns. You can see the browns are quite dry, so I need to add more water to this because we kind of want it to be more like this consistency, a little more squishable in a sense, like that. It stays in a clump. But you can see the material is definitely breaking down. So if you have a compost bin at home and you're curious as to what it should look like, something like this. Now what I did is I turned about 1/4 at a time, and then as you can see on this, I've added my fresh nitrogen. I did some major trimming of a tomato plant that kind of overtook a garden, so I have some of those trimmings in there. I've mixed it up just like this as I turn, and because it is a little dry, I am going to add some water in, just like this. Okay. I'm going to continue to turn a little bit more of the product. So when you're turning it, remember it's important that we're aerating our pile. If it's clumpy like this, I kind of just wiggle my pitchfork, break up any clumps. It's a fun process. Okay. The odors are very minimal. I smell a little bit of the food breaking down, but not too much. And as you can see at the very bottom, it got really wet and compacted. And this is kind of what's expected at the bottom of a compost pile. If you can imagine, as the water trickles down, to the bottom, the material itself starts breaking down. It gets compressed to the bottom there. So it's important to break up those clumps. Okay. Going to do a little bit more. And then I want to add some more of my food waste, nitrogen. Remember, these are your greens, high in nitrogen rich material. And if you remember, the other part of the compost pile is browns, dry material. So, I'm actually going to turn over this last one here. Mix this up again. Any questions yet, Ashley?
We do have a question from Vanessa.
Okay.
Are you ready for that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Vanessa asks, I have a lot of fruit flies in my new compost bin. Not so much in the one that is a month or so from being done. Is there a good way to get rid of them?
of your fruit flies. Okay, so if you are having a lot of fruit flies, like I've said in past videos, right, we always want to make sure that our food waste, our new stuff especially, is covered. So if you just walk out to your bin and say you just dumped your food waste like this, right, and then you covered your bin with the lid, then obviously with this exposed food like this, you're going to attract all those flies. Now, let me just mix this up a bit. But if you cover up that food waste with a thick layer of browns at the end, just like this, this should help reduce the amount of flies. Now, you still may get some flies. If they are so bad, you can always try putting in, like, sorry, it's hard to breathe with this one on. Take an old soda or water bottle. You can cut it in half and invert the top of the water bottle so the skinnier part is down inside there. Then you can add some apple cider vinegar and place that in your bin if you'd like. And then the fruit flies can make their way in and then they'll drown in the cider. So I recommend, though, first trying adding your thick layer of browns before resorting to that. But if you are having those issues, this is what you should do. If you are having those issues too with your worm bin, overabundance of flies with that, you're probably overfeeding your worms. So try taking a break of giving them food. In the meantime, you can freeze your food scraps and then slowly feed out more to your worms. Okay? Great question, though. It's probably the most common question that I get. So we do have some ants in here. Not a big issue. They're important for composting, like all bugs. All right, so let's go ahead and see if we have any more questions. We're going to move on. And if you're interested in buying a thermometer, let me just grab this, for your compost pile to monitor the temperature of your pile like this, if you go to riotempcompost.com, they were doing a 15% off sale for Compost Awareness Week. I just checked and it looked like the sale was still active, so you can get 15% off your composting thermometers on riotempcompost.com, and that's spelled REOTEMP compost.com, and the code is ICAW20. Okay, so go ahead and see if you can find that. Otherwise, Amazon, I've seen sometimes at Home Depot or nurseries sometimes sell these composting thermometers. And having a compost thermometer isn't exactly necessary, but it is extremely helpful. It's helpful because as you add in greens and you mix your compost pile, your aerobic bacteria usually get very active, and then the heat in your compost pile starts to get higher up into the 130, 140 range, okay, in this green section. And that's a good indicator that you have a well-balanced compost pile. When it's well-balanced, the breakdown process occurs at a much faster rate. So if you're keeping your pile at 120, 130 degrees on a pretty consistent basis, you may actually have siftable, usable compost in as little as 2 months or so. So as you can see in our pile over there, we didn't have too much finished material. Remember, that finished product looks like dark, rich soil. It doesn't really smell like rotting food anymore, and you can't really tell what the material is. So in that compost pile that we saw earlier, I can still differentiate between the greens and the browns. So I know that my compost isn't finished. It was also still at about 100 degrees before we turned it. So it's still pretty active. There's material that needs to break down. Now when your compost pile thermometer stays in the cooler side, 90 degrees or lower, and you did everything that you could, you added more nitrogen or greens, you turn the pile, and you're like, still low. It's not getting any hotter anymore. That's probably because you have finished compost that you can sift out and use, and then continue adding to your pile, and that should help pick up the heat. All right, any questions, Ashley?
From our frequently asked questions
Yeah.
list, one of the commonly asked questions is going to be, is newspaper safe to compost? Are the inks toxic?
All right, oh, I have compost on my glasses. Is newspaper safe? Yes, it is. The newspaper itself, the type of paper, has a higher lignin content, which means basically it has a woodier substance. So it usually takes a little bit longer to break down than some other types of browns. Now, newspaper nowadays is made usually from either water-based or soy-based ink. So it's safe, it's not toxic. And if there is any toxic chemicals in the newspaper, there's such a minute amount that with the bacterial organisms and fungi working together, they actually break down a lot of those chemicals. And it's safe to use. Now, make sure you stay away from things like glossy paper, like from magazines and photos, because those definitely contain some harmful chemicals to make those really vivid colors. So make sure you keep those out. But newspapers, if you're still receiving them, they're still okay to put in the compost pile. Shred them up if you can into smaller pieces, or even use them in your worm bins.
Kelly asked about, kind of on the same lines as Vanessa,
Okay.
fruit flies, but she's using a tumbler composter. Is there anything different you need to do to keep the flies
Okay.
down?
So with the tumblers, I have the same issue here. They have the most flies compared to the soil saver bins. And one of the main reasons why they have more flies is, look at it. It's an enclosed bin. Oh, you can't look at it, but you know what I mean. It's in an enclosed bin, and it's usually covered. So it's important that you're turning that. And if you have a large amount, put a thick layer of browns on top of that to help just cover up the food waste. Because once again, those fruit flies are coming in because they can smell and have easy access to the green material. What I've also done, if I'm out working in the garden, I leave the bin open. So to let it get some air and allow those fruit flies to kind of dissipate. So that's my suggestion. But I do notice that tumblers just have a little bit more flies to deal with. So putting one of those little apple cider vinegar fruit fly traps nearby a tumbler might be a good option. Anything else, Ashley?
Richard asks, how moist should I keep my compost? And how can I tell when it's too dry?
All right. So your compost should feel like a wrung out sponge. So at the bottom of the compost pile that we turned today, you might have noticed that there were some parts that were really wet and in a ball, and then there were other parts that were really dry and they weren't clumping together. So the stuff that was in a ball is kind of what you're looking for your moisture content. If you were to grab some compost in your hand, squeeze it. This is our moisture, what I call our moisture test. If water droplets start coming outside your knuckles or just dripping out of your hand, your pile is too wet. So either A, turn that pile, give it some oxygen, or B, add more brown or carbon materials. Now if you were to squeeze that compost, open up your hand, and the material kind of just fell apart. It didn't stay in a ball in your hand. That's when you know it's too dry. So Richard, if your compost is not staying together in a clump, then you need to either A, add more nitrogen, but maybe you look in there and you're like, wow, I really did add a lot of fruits and veggies. I still don't know why that it's a little bit more on the dry side. Make sure you dampen those browns. Sometimes you just need to soak them a little bit so they act like a sponge and bring everything together. I hope that answered your question, Richard.
Randy asked, has anybody asked about bleach white paper? Is it safe to use bleach white paper in your compost pile?
Bleached white paper. Okay, so that's okay to use. Same thing like paper plates and napkins. The amount of chemicals in those types of materials are very little. And as I was saying earlier, what's amazing about the FBI, the fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates of the compost pile, is that they actually can break down a lot of those chemicals, as well as the pesticides that you might have if you're not buying organic produce. So you shouldn't worry too much about the quality of your compost with the paper or pesticide laced fruits, because the chemical decomposition process will actually neutralize a lot of those chemicals. Now, things like DDT, which are very potent and harmful, will not break down in a compost pile, but they have been banned in the US. So you shouldn't run into those types of harmful chemicals. But bleached paper is okay to use.
Barry asked, is there a difference between mulch and compost?
Is there a difference? Okay, so there is a bit of a difference, but however, compost can be used as mulch. Mulch is often a type of material that you lay on the top surface to help prevent weeds, suppress weeds, help keep the soil temperature cooler, acts as a barrier between the sun, and it can actually absorb water and then put it into the soil beneath at a slower rate. So mulch comes in all different types of forms: wood chips, gravel, even plastic. Some people use recycled tires, leaves, straw, all those types of things can be used as mulch. Now, compost can be laid over the top just like mulch, but what's great about compost though is you can also mix it in deeper into the soil. You don't always want to do that like with wood chips and stuff like that. So that's what I would say is the major difference. So compost can be used as mulch, but mulch doesn't necessarily have the same benefits if it's mixed into the soil.
Another commonly asked question is, if I leave my greens in a sealed container for 2 weeks, is it still okay to use in the pile?
Yes it is. When you open that bin, it's probably very stinky though, and there's liquid or leachate forming at the bottom of that bin, but it is still okay to use. The way I see it is, hey, if there's mold growing in it, that's our fungi, right? It's already in that breakdown process, so guess what? It's going to break down even faster in the compost pile. So here at the Living Coast Discovery Center, with our composting program, staff and volunteers are able to take their food waste from home in a bucket and bring it to me here. Now, sometimes I don't put them into the pile for a week or two, so I definitely have some green mush in those buckets, and I added it to the pile, and they still break down just fine. If you don't have the means or you don't have buckets at home to store up your food waste, remember you can always freeze your scraps if you have extra space in your freezer. Putting in frozen fruits and vegetables to your worm bin or regular compost bin doesn't change anything in the compost pile. If anything, it adds a little more liquid actually to the pile, which is great. So we're going to be wrapping up soon, so if you have any more questions, now's the time to ask them. If I left and you didn't have time to get your questions answered, excuse me, you can look back at our previous videos. They're all on the Facebook page as well as YouTube. So feel free to share those videos on your page to any friends or family that may have questions about composting. But I'll be around on Instagram too next to do a few composting segments on there.
So one of our other most commonly asked questions is, can compost harm plants?
It can actually. Compost can harm plants if you apply it too soon. So if your compost is not fully cured, meaning it hasn't cooled down and broken down as much as it can. When you apply it to your garden, the material might still break down and it might still create some heat that can be detrimental to your plants. And if your compost isn't fully broken down yet, there could be some chemicals or nutrients, or even the soil itself can be a little too acidic. So depending on what type of plant you have, it could do some damage. So just make sure that if you are going to apply your compost to your garden, that you let it cure for a couple weeks, especially if it's still really chunky and you can still really see those browns. You just really want to make sure that the temperature has gone down below 80 degrees for sure before you apply it to your plants.
So we haven't gotten any more questions. However, we have gotten lots of comments stating that they have loved this series and you did a great job, and so many thank yous.
Oh, wow, great. Thank you, everybody. I love hearing that. And I just want to say keep up the good work. More people need to compost, and if you have the ability to compost, like you have a backyard, and maybe you have friends or family who live in an apartment, maybe they can help you out by bringing their food waste to you, or their leaves, their paper products, so you can add it to your compost pile. There's safe ways to still do that, even during our stay-at-home orders. You can fill up buckets, seal them up, disinfect the outside of the bucket, and then drop it at the doorstep of your neighbor or friend, and then they can take that bucket to their backyard and compost that waste. And then once they have some nice compost ready, that maybe they can give some of that compost back to you so you can feed your garden at home or on your porch or your little potted plants. All right, any last questions? All right. So thank you so much for joining me for my compost workshop series. It's been a pleasure. I wish you the best of luck and happy Mother's Day. Goodbye, everybody.